Tom Brady's big influence on the Raiders. Tom Brady has been making a huge impact on the Las Vegas Raiders' decisions lately. A recent report reveals just how much influence he's having, and it's pretty interesting. According to the article, the Raiders weren't totally sure about firing both Antonio Pierce and Tom Teskey. Even though their first season together ended with a tough 4-13 record, owner Mark Davis seemed unsure about making a change. He might have wanted to give the team a bit more time to turn things around. But here's where Tom Brady steps in. Since purchasing part of the Raiders in October, Brady has made it clear that a fresh start was needed. He convinced Mark Davis to move forward with firing both Pierce and Teskey. Brady is now expected to play a major role in helping find their replacements. A report from Vincent Bonsignore explained it like this. As recently as last week, there was a feeling inside the team that Davis would give both Pierce and Teskey another year. But Brady, who's now heavily involved with the Raiders, felt it was time for a total reset. It's fascinating to think that Mark Davis is letting Brady have such a big say in the team's direction. Of course, Brady's a proven winner with a deep understanding of the game. After all, he's won more Super Bowls than anyone, but it's still striking to see him shaping the Raiders' future so directly. Tom Teskey's first year and Brady's influence. When it comes to Tom Teskey, I honestly thought he did a solid job as general manager for the Raiders. He made smart decisions, especially when it came to drafting players and handling free agency. While building a team through free agency isn't always ideal, it's definitely possible to bring in some key players. For example, Teskey brought in important pieces like Christian Wilkins, one of the best defensive tackles in the league, and also added a superstar tight end and a top-notch center. Looking at his first year with the Raiders, I really think Teskey nailed it. Sure, the team didn't win a lot of games, but it's tough to turn a team around in just one season. You can't expect to win a Super Bowl right away. There's so much that goes into building a successful team, having the right coaching staff, making smart player signings, and managing the salary cap. It takes time to get everything right. Given all the challenges he inherited from the previous regime under Josh McDaniels and Dave Ziegler, I think Teskey did a good job. Now, when it comes to Antonio Pierce, I wasn't a fan of the hiring from the start. I understand why they made the change there, but with Tom Teskey, I wasn't sure firing him was the right move. That said, I do get where it's coming from, especially with Tom Brady's influence. Here's the thing. Mark Davis wasn't completely sure about letting Teskey go, but Brady essentially pushed him to make the decision. That's a huge impact for one person to have on a team's direction. The search for a new general manager. Even though Tom Brady has been pushing for changes like firing coaches and bringing in new faces, he's not going to take over the day-to-day management of the Raiders. The team still needs to hire a general manager to handle the regular operations. Right now, the focus is on finding the right fit to pair up with whoever takes over as head coach. A possible candidate for the GM role is Ray Agnew, the Detroit Lions assistant general manager. Ben Johnson, the Lions offensive coordinator, is familiar with Agnew, so if Johnson is hired as head coach, it makes sense that Agnew would join him as GM. This would be part of the Raiders' reset, and it's interesting to see how all these pieces are falling into place. What really stands out to me is how much influence Tom Brady is having. He's not just helping with firing people, he's driving the direction of the team. He's the one who pushed Mark Davis to make these big changes and go for a full reset. And honestly, a reset is something the Raiders might really need right now. It's also worth noting that without Brady's involvement, the Raiders might not even have landed an interview with Ben Johnson. According to an article by Albert Breer, Johnson initially planned to only interview with the Bears, Jaguars, and Patriots. But Brady's efforts to personally reach out to Johnson made all the difference. That's a big move on Brady's part, and it shows just how much his presence in Las Vegas is shaping the Raiders' future. Ben Johnson's consideration and Raiders GM situation Adam Schefter reported that Ben Johnson isn't going to interview for any job unless he's already seriously considering it. Essentially, Johnson made it clear that if he was interested in the Bears job, that would be the only one he'd interview for because he'd already be set on taking it. So for the Raiders to even get an interview with him, means they've caught his attention in some way. That's a positive sign. One thing the Raiders have going for them that the Bears and Jaguars don't is familiarity. The Bears have Ryan Poles as their GM, and the Jaguars have Trent Baalke. Both of those GMs are staying put, so if Johnson were to take either of those jobs, he'd be working with someone he's never worked with before. But if he comes to the Raiders, the GM they hire is likely someone he already knows. It's someone he's worked with before and who will value his opinion when it comes to building the roster. I actually agree with Tom Brady's thinking here. If they can land Ben Johnson and pair him with someone he trusts, it's a strong move for the future of the team. It's a big selling point for the Raiders, and it could help turn things around quickly. On a related note, there's also been some buzz about the Raiders potentially interviewing Denver Broncos' defensive coordinator Vance Joseph for the head coaching job. Some people have speculated that this might just be a Rooney Rule interview, but I don't agree with that. I think the Raiders might genuinely be interested in Joseph. Vance Joseph and the Raiders coach search, I think Robert Saleh would fit the criteria for the Rooney Rule, and the Raiders had already scheduled an interview with him in the past, so there was no need to check that box again. But Vance Joseph is someone I really want to highlight. He's been a great defensive coordinator, even though his previous stint as a head coach with the Denver Broncos didn't work out. What he brings to the table as a defensive coordinator is impressive. He knows how to run a solid defense and how to execute schemes. That's one of the reasons the Broncos have seen success defensively. What's really interesting, though, is a trend I noticed when looking at the list of coaches the Raiders are considering. There are 7 names on this list, and of those 7, 5 are defensive-minded coaches. That's kind of surprising, right? It's clear that the Raiders are focusing heavily on defensive candidates. But here's where I stand. If I were making the call, I'd lean toward hiring an offensive-minded coach. It's easier to find a coach who can run a good defense, but finding someone who can consistently run an explosive offense is a lot harder. You've got a handful of coaches like Arthur Smith, who excel at calling plays and building offenses, but after that, there are fewer standouts. To me, a great offense is where the game is won in today's NFL, so it's something to consider as the Raiders continue their search. Raiders focus on defensive coaches. When you look at coaches like Josh McDaniels, you can see they're good, but not necessarily great. To really make a difference, you need the top-tier guys like Sean McVay or Kyle Shanahan, coaches who can completely transform a team. And that's what the Raiders seem to be focusing on right now, a more defensive approach. Of the 7 coaches the Raiders have either interviewed or are planning to interview, the majority are defensive-minded. There's an interesting story about Mike Vrabel, too. Apparently, before Tom Brady reached out to him about the Raiders' head coaching job, Vrabel told Brady that he was already set on taking the Patriots job. So, he wasn't interested in the Raiders' position. CBS News reported this, though I'm not sure who initially broke the story. But it's clear that Vrabel wasn't going to interview with the Raiders, which means the Raiders have now reached out to 8 candidates, 6 of whom are focused on defense. Here are the names: Ben Johnson, Lions offensive coordinator; Aaron Glenn, Lions defensive coordinator; Steve Spagnuolo, Chiefs defensive coordinator; Todd Monken, Ravens offensive coordinator; Robert Saleh, Jets defensive coordinator; Pete Carroll, Seahawks head coach, historically a defensive guy; Vance Joseph, Broncos defensive coordinator; Mike Vrabel, Titans head coach. It's interesting that most of these candidates are defensive coaches. It could be because the Raiders are looking to strengthen their defense, but it also raises questions about whether they're overlooking offensive minds who might have a greater impact on the team's success. Raiders search and the importance of leadership. It's possible that some candidates haven't been reached out to yet because their teams are still in the playoffs. For example, the Buccaneers just played a playoff game, so the Raiders likely couldn't contact their offensive coordinator. The same could be true for other teams, like the Texans and their offensive coordinator Bobby Slowick. We don't really know what's going to happen, but the Raiders are clearly still in the process of finding the right fit for both general manager and head coach. That said, this is an exciting time for the Raiders. If the team can land a strong general manager and a talented head coach, I truly believe they'll have success. It always comes down to leadership. Those two positions are the foundation for building a winning team. Just a few years ago, when the Miami Dolphins hired Mike McDaniel, people questioned whether he could be a successful head coach. Fast forward to today, and McDaniel has proven himself as a solid leader. The Dolphins have one of the top offenses in the league, and part of that success is because McDaniel is great at what he does. Of course, I believe the Dolphins would be even better if they moved on from quarterback Tua Tagovailoa, but McDaniel's offensive schemes are keeping them competitive. Similarly, when Sean McVay took over the Los Angeles Rams, it was clear he was a special coach from the start. The Rams have been consistently good, no matter who's playing quarterback or what other challenges the team faces. That's the kind of impact a great coach can have. And you can say the same about Kyle Shanahan with the 49ers. His teams are competitive year after year, as long as the general manager is doing their job to support him. Ultimately, success comes from having strong leadership in place, and the Raiders are on the right path if they can get that right. Evaluating coaching options. Ben Johnson and beyond. I think for the Raiders, the key to success is hiring a great coach. If you get that right, everything else falls into place. Ben Johnson, in my opinion, is the guy who could be a game changer for the team. He has the potential to make a real difference. But I wouldn't overlook other options either. Bobby Slowick, the offensive coordinator for the Texans, could also be a great fit if the Raiders can land him. As for Todd Monken, while I'm not completely sold on him as an offensive coordinator, he did a great job this season with Lamar Jackson. Jackson arguably had his best year ever under Monken's system. So he's worth considering as well, but my preference would be to go with an offensive-minded coach. The Raiders could really use someone who knows how to run a dynamic offense, especially since success on the offensive side is critical in today's NFL. That said, I can't ignore the fact that the Raiders should also consider Patrick Graham as a potential head coach. I know this hasn't been a popular suggestion, but Graham is well respected in the Raiders' locker room. His situation is very different from Antonio Pierce's. Pierce was hired as a linebacker coach without much experience in top-tier play calling or scheme design, but Graham is well respected in the Raiders' locker room. His situation is very different from Antonio Pierce's. Pierce was hired as a linebacker coach without much experience in top-tier play calling or scheme design, but Patrick Graham has run elite defensive schemes with the Raiders and has been instrumental in the team's defensive success. If the Raiders are serious about continuity and building on what they've already started, Graham deserves to be in the conversation for head coach. Considering Patrick Graham and the coaching search, if the Raiders were to hire Patrick Graham, it would be similar to bringing in Steve Spagnuolo or Aaron Glenn. I personally don't believe in sticking with a defensive-minded head coach, but if they're going down that route, Graham definitely deserves consideration. The value of keeping the same defensive coordinator for a fourth year could be huge for continuity and stability. If the Raiders are serious about maintaining the defensive foundation they've built, Graham could be a good choice. In this case, replacing just the offensive staff might be easier than completely overhauling both sides of the ball. That said, I think Patrick Graham will be a head coach within the next 2 years. He's proven himself as a strong coach, and I would love to see him get the opportunity, whether it's with the Raiders or another team. Unfortunately, with the firing of Tom Teske, it seems less likely that Graham will be given the job this time around. If the Raiders were considering Graham, they probably would have kept Teske, given the work he did last year. But we'll see what happens. I still hope Graham gets the chance to be a head coach somewhere, and I believe he's ready for it. Now, I'd love to hear from you guys. There's a lot of news and rumors flying around, and many of the things we talk about on this channel come from insiders like Albert Breer and Vincent Bonsor. Some people question Bonsor's credibility, but he's deeply connected to the Raiders and has solid sources within the organization. When he reports something, it's worth paying attention to. So, let me know in the comments below. If you could pick one coach to lead the Raiders, who would it be? Drop your thoughts, hit the thumbs up, and subscribe for more content. I'll catch you guys next time with another video.